How her boss regretted cheating with her. A story of betrayal and redemption. The rain tapped against the windows like impatient fingers drumming on a desk. The dim light of the street lamps outside filtered through the half-drawn blinds, casting long, jagged shadows across the polished mahogany table in the corner of the office. I sat there, staring at my reflection in the black surface of my untouched coffee, the aroma sharp and bitter, like the truth I was slowly coming to terms with. I still remember the first time he walked in. His presence commanded the room, not in an overbearing way, but with the quiet confidence of someone who was used to getting what they wanted. Ethan Gray. Even his name sounded like it belonged in a novel. He was tall, perhaps a shade over 6 feet, with a lean, athletic build that suggested discipline rather than vanity. His tailored suit, a deep charcoal gray, clung to him like a second skin, and his crisp white shirt was unbuttoned just enough to suggest that he was comfortable bending the rules when it suited him. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. A piercing shade of ice blue, they seemed to see straight through me, as if peeling back the layers of my carefully constructed facade to uncover secrets I hadn't even admitted to myself. At the time, I thought those eyes held promises of adventure, of excitement. I was wrong. "Ms. Lane," he had said that first day, his voice smooth and low, carrying just enough of a lilt to make you want to lean in closer. "I've heard great things about you. I should have known better than to believe." Him. I remember how his compliment warmed me, not like the sun's glow, but like a slow burn, something that crept in without warning. It had been years since anyone had said something like that to me. My work had always been good, efficient, and reliable, but recognition, that was rare. I smiled. Just a polite smile at first. "Thank you, Mr. Gray. I appreciate that." "Call me Ethan," he said, flashing a disarming grin. "Formality's not really my thing." That grin was dangerous, though I didn't realize it then. It lingered in my mind far longer than it should have, accompanied by a hint of his cologne, sandalwood, and something faintly spicy. Weeks turned into months, and our working relationship evolved, or perhaps it unraveled. The lines blurred so slowly I didn't notice until they had disappeared entirely. At first it was the late nights, the shared cups of coffee, the occasional laughter over some joke that only we found funny. He had a way of making me feel like the smartest person in the room, even when I knew I wasn't. But it wasn't just work that tethered us. Ethan had a magnetism that drew people in, but it was the vulnerability beneath his polished exterior that kept me there. He spoke of dreams he'd abandoned, of pressures he carried, and though he never said it outright, of a marriage that seemed more like a partnership in survival than a union of love. "I envy you," he once said, leaning back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me in a way that made my pulse quicken. "You seem free." I laughed at that, a short, hollow sound. Free? That's not the word I'd use. "Then what would you call it?" he pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly, genuinely curious. I hesitated, fiddling with the edge of my notebook, caged maybe, lonely, trapped by my own choices, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Instead, I deflected. Focused. I'd call it focused. He didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the slight tilt of his head, but he didn't push. That was one of his many talents, knowing when to stop just short of breaking through someone's defenses. The first time it happened, it wasn't planned, at least not by me. It was a Friday evening, and the office was almost deserted. I was finishing up a report when Ethan appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, revealing the strong lines of his forearms. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. My stomach tightened, a warning bell I chose to ignore. For a while, we just talked. About work, about nothing, about everything. But the air was thick with something unsaid, something neither of us wanted to name. And then, without thinking, I reached for my coffee mug at the same time he reached for his. Our fingers brushed. I pulled back instinctively, but his hand lingered, his fingers curling slightly as if to catch mine. "Ethan, I know," he interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is wrong, but I can't stop thinking about you." I never thought one decision could unravel so much. It began with whispers, half-heard conversations that stopped when I entered the room, lingering glances from colleagues that held something between pity and judgment. At first I told myself it was paranoia, but the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deeply you bury it. I didn't know how Ethan's wife found out. Maybe it was a misplaced text, a charge on his credit card, or just the unmistakable shift in his demeanor. All I knew was that she did. And when she did, she didn't stay silent. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning. The office was buzzing with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, but the atmosphere shifted the moment she walked in. Evelyn Gray. I had only seen her once before, in a photograph on Ethan's desk. In person, she was even more striking. Tall and poised, with a willowy frame and an angular beauty that felt both intimidating and timeless. Her dark hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, and her emerald green eyes were sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't ask for directions. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight into the office, past the receptionist who stammered futile objections, and made her way to Ethan's door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched her. She didn't glance in my direction, but I felt the weight of her presence like a storm looming on the horizon. When the door closed behind her, the muffled sound of raised voices followed. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The fallout was swift and merciless. By the end of the week, Evelyn had filed for divorce. The news spread through the office like wildfire, accompanied by rumors and half-truths. Ethan's once unshakable composure began to crack, the stress etching lines into his face that hadn't been there before. And me? I became a pariah. Every glance felt like a judgment, every conversation like a thinly veiled condemnation. My work began to slip, the precision and focus I'd once prided myself on drowned out by the constant noise in my head. But the worst part wasn't the judgment. It wasn't even the guilt. It was the realization that I had been a fleeting distraction in Ethan's life. Nothing more. "I'm sorry," he said one night, weeks later. We were alone in the office, the space between us a chasm neither of us dared to cross. "For what?" I asked, my voice brittle. "For what happened with Evelyn? Or for what happened with us?" He looked away, his shoulders sagging under the weight of everything he had lost. "For everything. For hurting you. For hurting her. For ruining." He trailed off, his voice cracking. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that his regret was too little, too late. But all I could do was nod, my throat tight with unshed tears. The weeks turned into months. Ethan left the company shortly after the divorce was finalized, unable to face the whispers and the shame. I stayed, trying to rebuild what I could of, my reputation and my sense of self. But some scars never fade. Even now, years later, I still think about him sometimes, not with longing, but with a quiet ache. A reminder of the cost of choices made in moments of weakness. And I wonder if he thinks of me. If he remembers the woman who was both his accomplice and his downfall. If he regrets not just what we did, but the people we became in the process. The second betrayal time has a cruel way of repeating itself, of testing our resolve when we least expect it. Years after Ethan and I parted ways, I found myself in a different city, a different company, and, ironically, a different marriage. Life had moved on, yet some lessons remained painfully unlearned. This time, the betrayal wasn't mine. It was his. Marcus was everything Ethan wasn't. Where Ethan had been smooth and enigmatic, Marcus was steady and predictable. He was the kind of man who sent flowers on anniversaries, remembered my coffee order without fail, and never hesitated to tell me he loved me. At least, that's what I thought. It started with a whisper, just like before. I had been noticing the signs for months, the late nights at work, the mysterious texts that made him smile in a way I hadn't seen in years, the scent of a perfume that wasn't mine lingering on his jacket. But I told myself I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own guilt from the past onto him, until the day I wasn't. I found the message on his phone one evening while he was in the shower. I hadn't meant to look, but the notification had caught my eye, an unfamiliar name accompanied by a string of emojis that left little to the imagination. My hands shook as I unlocked his phone, my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat of dread. The texts were there, undeniable in their intimacy. I can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? I wish I could wake up next to you every morning. I stared at the words, feeling the room spin around me. My chest tightened, a mix of anger and heartbreak threatening to suffocate me. I heard the shower turn off and quickly put the phone back, my mind racing. When he came out, towel slung low on his hips, he smiled at me as if nothing had changed. "Hey," he said, running a hand through his damp hair. "What's for dinner?" I couldn't bring myself to answer. Instead, I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter to steady myself. "Marcus," I said finally, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "Who's Lily?" His expression faltered for a split second, just long enough for me to see the truth in his eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said too quickly, too defensively. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice rising. I saw the messages. For a moment, he just stared at me, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for an excuse. Then, finally, he sighed and sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "It wasn't supposed to mean anything," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "It just happened." I laughed bitterly at that. "It just happened? You think that makes it better?" "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand over his face. "I didn't mean to hurt you." The days that followed were a blur of arguments, silence, and sleepless nights. Part of me wanted to walk away, to leave him the way Evelyn had left Ethan. But another part of me, the part that remembered my own mistakes, hesitated. Was this karma? A twisted kind of justice for what I had done years ago? Or was it something else? The price of betrayal. A tale of revenge. Revenge wasn't my first instinct. At first I wanted answers, clarity, a way to make sense of the chaos Marcus had unleashed in our lives. But as the days stretched into weeks, clarity became a cold and distant concept. What replaced it was something darker, sharper, and infinitely more satisfying. I didn't plan it all at once. It started as a fleeting thought, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. But that whisper grew louder with every passing day. With every forced apology from Marcus, and every sleepless night spent staring at the empty space in our bed where trust used to lie. If he could betray me so easily, why should I let him get away with it? I began with her, Lily. She wasn't hard to find. Social media has a way of betraying secrets faster than any message ever could. It took me less than an hour to find her profile, her bright smile beaming in every carefully curated post. She was younger than me by at least a decade, with a look that screamed effortless beauty. Perfect hair, perfect skin, perfect life. I hated her instantly, but hating her wasn't enough. I needed her to feel the cracks beneath her perfect facade, the way Marcus had shattered mine. The first step was subtle, a fake email address, an anonymous message. You don't know me, but I know you, and I know Marcus. You're not the only one in his life, you know. I hope you didn't believe all his promises. They sound so convincing until you realize he said the same words to someone else. I sent it late at night, knowing it would reach her inbox by morning. And then I waited. The response came faster than I expected. Who are you? What do you mean? Are you his wife? Her desperation was palpable even through the screen. I could have stopped there, let the seed of doubt take root. But I wasn't done. Step 2. Marcus's world. I knew Marcus prided himself on his image, at work, with friends, in every aspect of his life. He thrived on being seen as the dependable, charming family man. So I started chipping away at that image, piece by piece. I made anonymous calls to his workplace, hinting at improprieties. I'm concerned about your employee, Marcus Lane. I've heard some troubling things. I thought you should know. I leaked snippets of his texts with Lily, carefully doctored to imply more indiscretions than the one I already knew about. Enough to raise eyebrows, to make people question him. By the time Marcus began to suspect something was wrong, the cracks in his world were too wide to ignore. He confronted me one night, his face pale and drawn, the confident man I once knew replaced by someone frazzled and uncertain. "What are you doing?" he demanded, slamming his phone down on the table. "I know this is you." I looked up from my glass of wine, my expression calm. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb, Sarah. The messages, the calls, the rumors at work. You're trying to destroy me." I set my glass down slowly, meeting his gaze with icy determination. "Destroy you? Marcus, I didn't destroy you. You destroyed yourself the moment you chose her over me." The final blow came weeks later. I arranged a meeting with Lily, pretending to be a kind, forgiving wife who simply wanted to talk. She was hesitant but curious, and when we finally sat across from each other in a quiet cafe, I could see the doubt and guilt written all over her face. "I just want you to know the truth," I said, my voice trembling just enough to seem genuine. "Marcus and we've been trying to work things out. He told me about you, but he promised me it's over. I thought you deserved to know." Her face crumbled, the weight of my carefully crafted lie sinking in. He said he wasn't happy with you, that he wanted to leave." I forced a sad smile. "That's what he always says, isn't it? You're not the first, and you won't be the last." I left her there, tears streaming down her face, clutching her phone, like it was a lifeline. By the time I was done, Marcus's life was in shambles. Lily left him. His reputation at work was tarnished. And I walked away from the wreckage with my head held high, a quiet satisfaction settling in my chest. Revenge didn't heal the wounds he'd left, but it gave me something else: control. And for the first time in years, I felt free. Marcus's perspective. The ruins of a double life. They say karma is a patient hunter, but I never expected it to come for me so quickly, or so ruthlessly. When Sarah confronted me about Lily, I thought I could talk my way out of it. I'd always been good at smoothing things over, at giving just enough truth to quiet the storm without letting the full force of my lies come crashing down. But Sarah wasn't playing by the old rules anymore. I first noticed the cracks in my life when the rumors started at work. Whispers in the hallway, pointed glances in meetings. I couldn't prove it, but I knew someone was feeding the fire. And then there were the messages, anonymous tips to HR, vague accusations about inappropriate behavior. My boss called me in, his tone more serious than I'd ever heard. "Marcus, I don't know what's going on in your personal life, but it's bleeding into the office. Get it together." It was humiliating. Worse, it was effective. My spotless professional record The thing I'd spent years building was unraveling, thread by thread. At home, Sarah was a fortress. She wasn't screaming or crying, the way I thought she might. She was calm, composed, like a predator waiting for her prey to step into the trap. Every time I tried to talk to her, to explain or apologize, she gave me that cold, distant look that made my skin crawl. "You made your choices, Marcus," she said one night, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Now you get to live with them." I should have seen the warning in her eyes, but I was too focused on trying to salvage what was left of my double life. And then there was Lily. I thought she'd be my escape, my sanctuary. But when she texted me one evening, "We need to talk," I knew something was wrong. We met at the park, the same place where we'd shared stolen moments of laughter and longing. But this time, her face was tight with anger and pain. "Did you tell her about us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," I said quickly, trying to take her hand, but she pulled away. "Lily, Don't!" she snapped, tears welling in her eyes. "She came to me, Marcus. She told me everything, that you promised her the same things you promised me, that I wasn't the first." My heart sank. "She's lying." She?" Lily's voice cracked, her anger giving way to despair. "Because now I don't know what to believe. You told me you loved me, that you wanted to leave her for me. Was any of it true?" I couldn't answer, not in a way that mattered. The days that followed were a blur of loss. Lily blocked me. My colleagues grew colder. And Sarah? She seemed to thrive in my misery, her quiet satisfaction a constant reminder of just how deeply I had underestimated her. One evening, I came home to find her packing a suitcase. "Where are you going?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. "I'm not going anywhere, Marcus. You are." She handed me an envelope. Divorce papers. As I sat alone in a cheap apartment weeks later, surrounded by the remnants of my shattered life, I finally understood the depth of what I had lost. Sarah had been my rock, the woman who stood by me through every challenge, every failure. And I'd thrown it all away for a fleeting thrill, a moment of weakness that turned into a nightmare. I wanted to hate her for what she'd done, for the whispers, the sabotage, the cold precision with which she dismantled my world. But deep down, I knew she hadn't destroyed me. I'd done that all on my own. Revenge for betrayal. The final act. The thing about revenge is that it's never truly over. It lingers, a shadow that stretches far beyond its intended purpose. For me, it wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about ensuring that the echoes of his betrayal followed him wherever he went. I wasn't finished. Not yet. After Lily left him, I focused on the parts of Marcus's life that still gave him a sense of security. The job he clung to, the friends who still believed his carefully crafted facade, the financial stability he had always taken for granted. I made it my mission to strip him of all of it. I started with his reputation. Using an anonymous email account, I sent out details of his affair to key figures in his professional circle. The tone was measured, almost clinical, but the message was clear. Marcus Lane was not the man he pretended to be. "I thought you should know about the kind of person Marcus is outside of work. His actions have deeply hurt those closest to him, and I can only imagine how this might reflect on his professional integrity." The fallout was immediate. His co-workers avoided him. His boss started questioning his reliability. Promotions that had once seemed certain slipped through his fingers. Next, I turned my attention to his finances. Marcus had always been meticulous about money, but he wasn't as careful as he thought. Over the years, he'd taken out small loans for his personal projects, assuming they would never catch up to him. They did. I anonymously tipped off his creditors about discrepancies in his payment history, triggering audits and late fees that quickly spiraled out of control. Watching him struggle to stay afloat gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. But the most satisfying part of my revenge came when I reached out to the people who mattered most, to Marcus, his friends, his family. I painted a picture of the man he truly was, the lies he had told, the promises he had broken. Some were shocked, others were disappointed, and a few, to my surprise, were unsurprised. He's always been good at hiding things, one of his oldest friends admitted when I met with her for coffee, but I guess even he couldn't keep it up forever. By the time I was done, Marcus was a shadow of the man he had once been. He moved out of the city, unable to face the life he had built or destroyed. As for me, I stood among the ruins, with a strange mix of emotions. Satisfaction, yes, but also a quiet sadness. Revenge had given me power, control, a sense of justice, but it hadn't healed the wounds he'd left behind. Months later, I found myself standing on the shore of a quiet beach, the waves lapping at my feet. The wind carried the salty scent of the ocean, and for the first time in years, I felt free. I didn't forgive Marcus. I didn't forget what he had done. But I let go of the anger, the bitterness that had consumed me for so long. Revenge had its place, but it wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of something new, Sarah's new beginning, rising from the ashes. The ocean became my refuge in the months that followed. There was something restorative about the rhythmic pull of the waves, the endless horizon stretching beyond my sight. It reminded me that life moved forward no matter how broken I had felt in the aftermath of Marcus's betrayal. Revenge had been my armor, my way of reclaiming control. But it wasn't a place I could stay forever. I had spent so much time dismantling his life that I barely noticed how much of my own still needed rebuilding. It started with the little things. I cleared out the house, stripping it of everything that reminded me of Marcus and our life together. Old photos, his books, even the little trinkets we'd picked up on trips, all of it went into boxes that I left on the curb. As the physical remnants of him disappeared, so did the heaviness that had settled in my chest. My home became a blank canvas, and I filled it with things that reflected me. Soft, earthy tones, cozy furniture, walls adorned with art from local markets. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine. I threw myself into work next. I'd spent years supporting Marcus's ambitions, often putting mine on hold to help him succeed. But now I had nothing holding me back. I took on challenging projects, networked aggressively, and attended every conference I could find. My colleagues began to notice, and so did my superiors. When the promotion came, Director of Strategic Initiatives, it felt like validation, not just of my abilities, but of the strength I had rediscovered. Socially, I ventured cautiously. Trust wasn't something I was ready to give freely, but I also knew I couldn't live in isolation. I started by reconnecting with old friends, people I had drifted away from during my marriage. They welcomed me back with open arms, their warmth a balm for the loneliness I hadn't even realized I was carrying. One friend, Melissa, became a particularly strong anchor. Over wine one evening, she looked at me with a knowing smile. "You're glowing, Sarah," she said, "like you've finally stepped out of the shadows." I smiled back, realizing she was right. Then there was the art class. It was a whim, something I signed up for on a rainy Tuesday evening when the house felt too quiet. The instructor, a wiry, older man with a silver ponytail and an infectious laugh, encouraged us to paint from the heart. "Don't worry about perfection," he said. "Worry about truth." My first painting was a mess of colors, a chaotic swirl of reds and blacks that mirrored the storm I had lived through. But with each session, my brushstrokes grew calmer, more deliberate. Art became my therapy, a way to express the things I couldn't quite put into words. And then, unexpectedly, there was someone new. His name was Daniel. He was a sculptor who shared the studio space, his hands always covered in clay. He had an easy smile and a way of listening that made you feel like the only person in the room. At first, our conversations were casual, polite exchanges about technique and materials. But one evening, as we cleaned up after class, he asked, "What made you start painting?" I hesitated, my instinct to keep my walls up. But something about him felt safe. I needed to find myself again, I admitted. He nodded, his gaze steady. I get that. Sometimes creating is the only way to heal. Our friendship grew slowly, organically. Daniel didn't push, didn't demand. He was just there, a steady presence in a world that had felt so uncertain. One evening, as we sat on the beach sharing a bottle of wine, he looked at me with a question in his eyes. "Do you think you'll ever trust again?" I considered the question, the weight of it pressing against my chest. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but I think I'm willing to try." Sarah's new beginning wasn't about erasing the past. It was about reclaiming her future. She learned to find joy in the small things. A sunrise over the water, the feel of paint beneath her fingers, the quiet laughter of friends who truly cared. And while the scars of betrayal remained, they became part of her story, not the defining chapter. She was more than a woman scorned. She was a woman reborn. The pivotal moment. Letting go it was a late autumn evening, the kind where the air had just enough bite to remind you winter was near. Daniel and I had spent the day at a local craft fair, wandering between booths filled with handmade jewelry, ceramics, and paintings. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of amber and violet, he suggested we head back to his workshop. "There's something I want to show you," he said, his tone laced with quiet anticipation. The workshop was warm, lit by the soft glow of overhead lamps. The smell of clay and wood filled the air, grounding me in the moment. Daniel led me to the back of the room, where a large sculpture sat beneath a draped cloth. "I've been working on this for a while," he said, his voice hesitant. "It's personal." I nodded, sensing the weight of the moment. With a deep breath, he pulled the cloth away. The sculpture was breathtaking. It depicted two figures, one reaching out, their hand extended in a gesture of longing, while the other stood, just out of reach, their head turned as if torn between stepping forward or holding back. The details were exquisite. The tension in their muscles, the emotion etched into their faces, the space between them heavy with unspoken words. I stared at it, my throat tightening. "It's us," I whispered. Daniel nodded, his eyes fixed on the sculpture. "I started it after that night at the gallery. I couldn't get the space between out of my head, and then I thought about us, where we are, where we've been. This is what it feels like sometimes. Like we're still standing in that space, afraid to close the gap." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't yet said to each other. "I've been scared," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Scared to trust, to let someone in. It's easier to keep my distance, to stay in that space." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "I know, and I've been afraid too. Afraid I'll hurt you, or that I'll fail to be the person you deserve." His honesty was disarming, and for the first time I felt the walls around my heart begin to crack. "But Sarah," he continued, his voice steady, "what if we stop being afraid? What if we meet in the middle, no matter how messy it gets?" Tears welled in my eyes, and I let them fall. "I don't want to live in the space anymore," I said, my voice breaking. Daniel reached out then, his hand brushing against mine. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. I took his hand, holding it tightly as if anchoring myself to this moment. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. "Together." That night, something shifted. between us. It wasn't just about trust or vulnerability. It was about choice. We chose each other, not because it was easy, but because it felt right. As we stood there, framed by the glow of the workshop lights and the sculpture that now felt like a promise, I realized that I wasn't just healing from the past. I was building a future. Challenges Sarah and Daniel face. The struggle to build a future. The first months after that night in the workshop were a delicate balance between joy and uncertainty. We had made our choice to step forward together, but the road ahead wasn't as simple as it had seemed in the warmth of that moment. I wanted to believe that the connection we shared could withstand anything, but the truth was, healing wasn't linear. Trust was fragile, and even as we grew closer, the echoes of past hurts, both mine and Daniel's, often came crashing back like waves against a cliff. One of the first challenges we faced was my lingering fear of being vulnerable. I had learned to guard my heart, to protect myself from betrayal. When Marcus had broken my trust, it had shattered something deep within me, and though Daniel never gave me a reason to doubt him, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before I was hurt again. There were nights when I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask. What if I'm not enough? What if this all ends the way it did before? And so, I withdrew. One evening, after a dinner where I had been quiet and distant, Daniel pressed me gently. "What's going on with you?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I shook my head, avoiding his gaze. "Nothing. I'm just tired." But he wasn't buying it. "You know, I don't expect you to have all the answers right now," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But if something's wrong, we can work through it. You don't have to face this alone." The words hit me like a punch. For a brief moment, I saw the man I was becoming afraid to trust fully, standing before me with open hands, offering me a way out of my own darkness. But I couldn't take it. Not yet. "I don't know how to trust again, Daniel," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "I've been hurt before, and I'm afraid of losing again." There was silence between us. Not an uncomfortable one, but one filled with understanding, as if Daniel had anticipated this moment. "I know you've been hurt, Sarah," he said quietly. "I can't erase that for you. But I want you to know that I'm not him. I'm not going anywhere." The vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty, cut through my walls, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself feel the weight of what I had been carrying. "I need time," I whispered. "I need to take it slow." The second challenge we faced was our different ideas about the future. Daniel was a man who thrived on spontaneity. He lived in the present, in the joy of creating, of experiencing life as it came. I admired that about him, but I also wanted stability, a clear path forward. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know where we were going, to have a sense of control over the uncertain road ahead. But Daniel, ever the artist, resisted the idea of planning too far in advance. One evening, as we sat in his studio, working side by side, I voiced my concerns. "I can't help but feel like we're drifting," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "I don't know where this is going. What do we want out of this? What do we want together?" Daniel paused, looking up from the clay he was molding. "I want us to grow, to see where this takes us." "That's not enough," I replied, the words sharper than I intended. "I need to know if you see a future with me. I can't live in limbo." Daniel sighed, setting down his tools and walking over to me. He reached out, gently cupping my face in his hands, his thumb, brushing away the tears I hadn't realized were falling. "I see a future with you," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "I just don't have all the answers yet." But that doesn't mean I'm not here. I want to walk this road with you, whatever that looks like." And just like that, the tension between us softened. I knew he wasn't offering me certainty, but he was offering me something far more important, the promise of his presence, of us, one step at a time. The third challenge we faced came unexpectedly, a shadow from Daniel's past. One evening, as we sat in the park, Daniel's phone rang. I noticed the name on the screen before he had a chance to pick it up. Emma, his ex. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face neutral. He answered, stepping away to talk in low tones. I tried to ignore the feeling of unease creeping into my chest, but it gnawed at me. When he returned, I tried to act casual. "Is everything okay?" He hesitated before answering, his gaze not quite meeting mine. "She's going through some things. I told her I'd help if I could." I nodded, but inside my mind was racing. Why was he still in contact with her? What did it mean? Later that night, as we sat in the quiet of his living room, I finally asked, "Daniel, are you still in love with her?" It was a question I didn't want to ask, but it was there, hanging, between us like a cloud. He was silent for a moment. Navigating the challenges, Sarah and Daniel's journey together. After the quiet tension that followed Daniel's conversation with Emma, there was a shift. Not in the sense that we grew apart, but in how we began to redefine the boundaries of our relationship. The past, both mine and his, had a way of weaving itself into our present, testing the strength of the bond we were trying to build. But it was in these moments of discomfort, in these tests, that we began to understand what it truly meant to be partners, not in the idealized sense, but in the real, messy, and vulnerable way that relationships often unfold. The issue of trust. It had been a week since Daniel's phone call with Emma, and the weight of that conversation still lingered in the air between us. I hadn't brought it up again, but I could tell Daniel sensed the unease that still clung to me. We had both taken a step back, quietly reflecting on where we stood. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Daniel broke the silence. "I know things have been tense," he said softly, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee mug. "And I understand why. I should have communicated better. I don't want you to feel like I'm still holding on to something from the past." His words cut through the fog of my own doubts, and I felt a surge of gratitude, not for the fact that he was apologizing, but for the fact that he cared enough to address the unspoken. "I trust you, Daniel," I said quietly, though I knew it would take time to rebuild that trust fully. But it's hard. It's hard because every time I let myself open up, I'm afraid of getting hurt again. I don't want to carry that weight forever, but I don't know how to stop feeling it. He reached for my hand then, his touch warm, grounding. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to let me in, Sarah. To trust me, not just with your heart, but with your fears, your doubts. I'm not going anywhere. I want to be here with you, all of you." I held his gaze, searching for any trace of insincerity, but all I found was vulnerability. His heart laid bare for me. Slowly, I nodded. We weren't perfect, but together, we could be whole. The future and our different paths. As the weeks passed, the conversation about our future came up again, this time with less tension and more understanding. We were sitting in a small cafe, our favorite, when I broached the subject, my words tentative but deliberate. "Daniel, where do you see us in a year? Or two?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual. Because sometimes I feel like we're still floating, just enjoying the moment without really thinking about what comes next. He was silent for a moment, his fingers tapping the edge of his cup. "I'm not sure I want to plan that far ahead," he said at last, meeting my eyes. "I know that sounds reckless, but I've always felt that life is too unpredictable, and I'd rather focus on what we have now than worry about what's going to happen tomorrow." I sighed, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. But what if now isn't enough? What if we need something more, something concrete to anchor us when things get tough? Daniel's expression softened, and he reached across the table, placing his hand over mine. I get it. I do. You need certainty, Sarah, and I respect that. But for me, I think the beauty of a relationship is in the unknown. It's about trusting that we're strong enough to face whatever comes together. I stared at our intertwined hands, my mind racing. I wanted security, but I also knew deep down that life, like art, wasn't about neatly planned lines. It was about embracing the messiness, the unexpected turns, the unspoken moments that made everything meaningful. After a long pause, I spoke. I don't know if I can live in the unknown forever, Daniel, but I do know that I'm willing to try. I just need to feel like we're both invested in this, no matter where it takes us. He smiled, squeezing my hand. I'm all in, Sarah. All in. The shadow of the past. The biggest challenge, however, remained the shadow of our pasts, both mine and Daniel's. For me, it was the lingering fear that I wasn't worthy of unconditional love, that I would never fully escape the ghost of Marcus's betrayal. For Daniel, it was the scars left by his previous relationship with Emma, the unanswered questions about whether he could truly love again without the echoes of her voice in his mind. One evening, we found ourselves in the quiet of Daniel's apartment after a long day of work. We hadn't spoken much, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough?" he asked, his voice raw, vulnerable. "Like no matter what you do, there's always something more you could have given?" I looked at him, a pang of understanding shooting through me. "I used to feel that way all the time," I admitted, "especially after Marcus. I thought I wasn't enough, that I'd never be enough for anyone else." Daniel nodded. The future of Sarah and Daniel, building a life together. As time passed, Sarah and Daniel's relationship began to take shape in ways neither of them could have fully predicted. The challenges they faced weren't erased, but instead became the building blocks for a deeper understanding of each other. Trust wasn't something that could be given and forgotten. It had to be nurtured, tested, and redefined through every new phase of their journey together. The first step into a shared future. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Sarah and Daniel found themselves on the cusp of a new chapter. The apartment they shared felt like a space that had grown around them, evolving from a place of uncertainty to one of comfort, warmth, and belonging. Every corner held echoes of their shared moments, the lingering smell of coffee from early mornings, the worn leather of the couch they had spent hours on during quiet evenings, and the small, spontaneous pieces of art Daniel had started hanging on the walls, each one a visual representation of his thoughts, his love for her. The conversation that morning wasn't a big one. It wasn't a grand declaration of commitment, nor was it about resolving past issues. It was about something simpler, something more grounded. "We need to start looking for a house," Sarah said, glancing up from the book she had been reading. Her voice was calm, but the weight of the words felt significant. Daniel, who had been absent-mindedly tapping his fingers on the coffee table, looked up at her. For a moment, there was just silence between them, the kind that felt both intimate and profound. Then he smiled. "I was thinking the same thing," he said. His tone was light, but his eyes reflected something deeper, a recognition that they had come to a point where moving forward meant stepping into something more permanent. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the moment. It wasn't just about buying a house. It was about building a future that would require compromise, understanding, and patience. It was about crafting something that was truly theirs, a place where they could weave their dreams and fears into the fabric of their lives. Learning to live together, finding the right house wasn't easy. There were compromises on both sides. Sarah wanted something with a garden, her quiet escape from the bustling world. Daniel, on the other hand, wanted a space with an open studio area for his work, a place where he could continue to create without limitations. They found a small, rustic house on the outskirts of town that had both a garden and a spacious room, with high ceilings perfect for Daniel's artwork. The house itself, with its creaky wooden floors and light-filled rooms, became a symbol of their commitment to each other. The process of moving in, sorting through boxes, making decisions about where to place the couch, painting the walls together, was a daily reminder of their shared future. There was an unspoken rhythm to it, a dance of compromise and collaboration that felt like the true essence of what it meant to be a partner. But of course, there were moments of friction. Daniel's spontaneous nature often clashed with Sarah's need for order and structure. She liked things to be planned. Daniel preferred to go with the flow. Sometimes, when decisions had to be made about the house, whether it was the color of the walls or the arrangement of furniture, there were moments of tension. But with each disagreement, they learned to listen to each other more deeply, to understand that their differences didn't mean they weren't aligned in the bigger picture. It was in those moments, where their frustrations bubbled to the surface, that their true connection became clearer. They weren't trying to change each other, but to grow together, facing new fears. As they settled into their new home, however, new challenges arose. Sarah's fear of being hurt again had not disappeared entirely. There were days when, out of nowhere, a memory of her past would flood her thoughts, and with it, the fear that maybe she wasn't worthy of this new life, this new love. On these days, she would become quiet, distant, retreating into herself. One evening, as Sarah sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel came outside and sat beside her. He could sense the distance between them, the unspoken weight that had been growing in the space between them. "Hey," he said gently, reaching for her hand. "What's going on inside your head?" Sarah didn't immediately respond. She gazed out at the garden, her fingers twisting together nervously. "I don't know," she said finally. I just keep wondering if I'm doing the right thing, if I'm really ready for this. For you." Daniel squeezed her hand, his gaze soft and understanding. "Sarah, you don't have to be perfect. I know you've been through a lot, but this," he motioned between them, "this is real. I'm here." A new phase in Sarah and Daniel's life together. The quiet hum of their home had become a familiar melody, a rhythm of daily life that had grown to fit them both. The years had shaped Sarah and Daniel in ways they hadn't fully anticipated. They had learned the art of compromise, the value of patience, and the power of shared dreams. Their connection had evolved from the raw vulnerability of new love into a bond that felt as solid as the foundation they had built together, yet flexible enough to adapt to whatever came next. The news that changed everything. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that started like any other. Sarah was at the kitchen counter sipping her coffee, scanning emails on her phone. Daniel was in his studio, lost in the swirl of his art, his brushes moving across the canvas in a fluid motion. The day felt like one of those rare moments of peace, the kind they both longed for amidst the constant ebb and flow of their busy lives. Then the phone rang. It was a call Sarah wasn't expecting, one that would alter the course of their future. "Sarah, I have some news for you." Her sister's voice crackled through the line, sounding both urgent and excited. "Mom's not doing well. The doctors say she might not have long. I know this is a lot, but I think it's time for you to come home." Sarah's heart stopped for a beat. She had known her mother's health had been declining, but hearing it in those terms, the blunt finality of it, brought a rush of emotion she hadn't anticipated. Her mother had always been a rock, a steadfast presence in her life, and the i.e. thought of losing her was a blow she wasn't ready for. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Sarah replied, her voice trembling despite her best effort to remain calm. After she hung up, the world felt a little quieter, the weight of the call pressing heavily on her shoulders. She walked into the studio where Daniel was bent over his work, focused and unaware of the storm that had just entered her world. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice shaking as the words left her lips. "I have to go. My mom, she doesn't have much time." Daniel turned to her, his expression softening immediately. The shift in her energy was palpable, and he knew something significant had happened. He set down his paintbrush, moving toward her with purpose. "I'll go with you," he said firmly, his hand reaching for hers. There was no hesitation in his voice, no question about it. He knew what it meant for her, and he wasn't about to let her face it alone. Sarah shook her head, a mixture of gratitude and guilt flickering across her face. "I don't want to drag you into this, Daniel. It's a family thing, and I don't know what I'll need. I need to be with her." He didn't argue. Instead, he simply cupped her face in his hands, his gaze steady and reassuring. "I'm here, Sarah. Wherever you need me, whatever you need, I'm with you. You don't have to carry this alone." His words, steady and unwavering, broke through her wall of fear. Sarah leaned into his touch, allowing herself a brief moment to feel the depth of his support before pulling back. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll need you when I get back. I'm not sure what's ahead, but I know it won't be easy." "You don't have to know yet," he replied, his voice full of quiet resolve. "One step at a time. We'll face it together when you get back." The long road ahead. The days that followed were filled with the raw intensity of grief and the quiet despair that settled over Sarah's family as they prepared for the inevitable. Sarah was there by her mother's side, holding her hand, speaking to her in the moments when words were all they had left. It was an emotionally draining time, a whirlwind of hospital visits, family discussions, and small moments of peace where Sarah tried to connect with the woman who had shaped her life in so many ways. She knew it wasn't just her mother's passing that weighed on her, but also the fear of losing a piece of her own identity. As much as she had grown and become stronger in her relationship with Daniel, the idea of returning to her family home, the place that had once been a source of pain, brought its own set of emotions. Her thoughts often drifted back to Daniel, to the quiet comfort of their home, to the space they had carved for each other in a world that felt so overwhelming at times. She realized that in his absence, the sense of calm he brought with him was more important than she had ever given credit for. The return home. When Sarah finally returned, the house felt different, quieter, emptier. It was a place now marked by the absence of the woman who had given so much of herself to those around her. The grief was raw, palpable, but Sarah knew that she couldn't allow herself to stay there forever. She had to face the future, to step forward into whatever new phase awaited her. Daniel was there, waiting for her, as he always was. Sarah's next steps, reclaiming her future. As the days in the coastal town unfolded, Sarah felt the gentle rhythm of the waves seeping into her soul, calming the storm that had long raged within her. The air, salty and fresh, seemed to offer a new sense of possibility, one that was both liberating and grounding. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself thinking not about the things she had lost, but about the things she could still gain. Her mother's passing had shifted something, deep within her, a reordering of her priorities. She had spent so much of her life living for others, for the expectations placed upon her, whether by family, work, or the people she loved. Now, in the wake of this profound loss, Sarah realized that the path forward had to be hers. and hers, alone. A moment of clarity. One evening, Sarah stood on the beach, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The sun had dipped below the edge of the world, leaving behind a soft glow that reflected off the water. Daniel stood a few paces behind her, giving her space, knowing that sometimes the quiet was all she needed to process the depth of her thoughts. "I don't need to keep running," Sarah thought, as she gazed out at the endless expanse of ocean. "I don't need to keep trying to be someone I think others want me to be. I need to be Sarah, the woman I've always been, beneath all the layers I've built over the years." Her mother had been a symbol of strength, but also of sacrifice, sacrificing her own desires and dreams for the sake of others. And while Sarah had admired that strength, she knew she couldn't follow that same path. She couldn't lose herself in service to others. She had already done that, and it had nearly destroyed her. "I have to live for myself," Sarah realized. "I have to build the life I want, not the life I think I'm supposed to have." The realization was both freeing and terrifying. There were so many pieces of her life that she had yet to explore, so many aspects of herself that had been dormant for too long. Embracing change and building her own path. Back in their home, after days of reflection, Sarah began to map out what her next steps would look like. It started small. A journal, a list of ideas, a quiet declaration to herself that she was ready to take control of her life in a way she never had before. She revisited her work, thinking about the promotion she had turned down not long ago. That decision, though born of a desire to protect her personal life, now felt like a missed opportunity. What would it look like to fully embrace her career? What if she could climb higher, not just for the accolades, but for the personal fulfillment it could bring her? "I've been avoiding it," she confessed to Daniel one evening as they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, their cups of tea cooling between them. "But I want to go for it. I want to stop holding back." Daniel, ever supportive, nodded without hesitation. "I think you'll be amazing, Sarah, but only if it's something you really want. Don't do it for anyone else. Do it for you." His words were a reminder that this was her journey, and the only person she had to answer to was herself. With his encouragement, Sarah crafted a plan. She reached out to her boss, expressing her interest in the promotion. There was a mix of excitement and nerves, but Sarah knew she was ready to push through them. She also decided to take up something she had always wanted to do: writing. Her journals were filled with reflections, observations, and stories, but she had never dared to share them. Maybe it's time to step into that world, she thought. It wasn't just about proving to the world what she was capable of. It was about proving to herself that she could be more than the sum of her past decisions. She signed up for a writing class, opening a door to something entirely new. The relationship with Daniel. A new balance. Throughout this transformation, Daniel stood beside her, not as a crutch, but as a partner in every sense of the word. Their relationship had always been strong, but now it was evolving into something deeper. There was no longer a need for her to hide parts of herself. Daniel didn't just accept her. He encouraged her to grow, to stretch beyond her comfort zones. There were times when Sarah felt the weight of balancing her career aspirations, her personal dreams, and her love for Daniel. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt empowered. The more she focused on herself, the more she realized how much room there was for him in her life, not as an anchor, but as a companion on this journey. One evening, as they walked along the beach together, Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She turned to Daniel, her heart full, and said, "Thank you for always believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." Daniel stopped, walking, taking her hands in his eyes warm and steady. "I believe in the woman you are, Sarah." Building their future together. As the seasons changed, Sarah and Daniel found themselves at a crossroads in their journey together. The foundation of their relationship, built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and unwavering support, had grown, sturdy, but now they were facing the natural evolution that comes when two individuals find themselves at different phases in their lives, yet still intertwined. Their home had become a sanctuary, a reflection of the lives they had carved out. Together, each room told a story. There was the bookshelf, where Sarah's growing collection of writings sat next to Daniel's canvases, his art spilling across the walls like vibrant whispers of his soul. The kitchen, where they cooked meals together, shared ideas and built memories, became the heart of their daily existence. Every detail, no matter how small, was a testament to the harmony they had achieved, and yet both felt there was more on the horizon. A conversation about the future. One evening, as the light from the setting sun bathed their living room in soft amber tones, Sarah and Daniel sat side by side on the couch, the weight of the world outside temporarily forgotten. The quiet hum of their home felt almost sacred, and yet there was an unspoken tension between them, a subtle energy that signaled something was about to shift. "I've been thinking," Sarah began, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her teacup, "about what we want, our future together. You know, not just the next few years, but the big picture." Daniel looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly in curiosity, his body language relaxed but attentive. "What do you mean?" "I think we've reached a place where we have to start asking the hard questions," she continued, her voice steady but filled with the weight of something more profound. "Like, what does the future look like for us, not just in our careers, but in our life together?" He paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I've always assumed we'd figure it out as we go, you know? We've always been able to adapt. But I get what you're saying. Maybe we need to have a clearer picture. What's on your mind?" Sarah took a deep breath, as if the act of sharing this thought had been brewing for some time. "I love where we are right now, Daniel, but I've been thinking about something bigger, about our life together, our next step. I want us to make decisions that take into account what we both want long term. Things like a family, maybe. Or, you know, a bigger space? A home that can reflect everything we've built and everything we still want to create." Daniel's heart skipped a beat at the mention of family. It wasn't something they had discussed directly before, though. He had always known Sarah valued the idea of it deeply. He turned his body toward her, his hand gently resting on hers. "I've thought about that too," he confessed. "I've always wanted to build a life with someone who shares that vision. I know we're both in a place where we can make these decisions now, but I think I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little nervous." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "I'm nervous, too, but not because I don't know if we're ready. I think we are. It's just that it's such a big decision, you know? The life we want to create together. Our home, our family, it's everything." The gravity of the conversation was not lost on either of them. It wasn't just about where they lived or what they did, but about how they saw their lives unfolding, how they would navigate the balance between their personal ambitions and the shared dreams they were beginning to set in motion. The life they wanted to create. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Daniel spent many nights talking, not just about the practicalities of life, like where they might want to live or how many children they imagined, but about their values, what they stood for and what they wanted to leave behind. These conversations were deep, often touching on difficult topics like vulnerability, responsibility, and the ways in which they had both changed over the years. They also discussed their fears, fear of failure, fear of losing each other, fear of not living up to their own expectations. But more than anything, these talks allowed them to rediscover each other, not just as lovers, but as two people who had grown so much, individually and together. They found new layers to one another, peeling away the years of surface-level understanding, diving into the depths of who they truly were and who they wanted to become. It wasn't just about the future. It was about how they would build it, how they would nurture their individual passions while continuing to support each other's growth, how they would face challenges, both the known and unknown, with the strength of the bond they had created together. As Sarah's writing career flourished and Daniel's art continued to evolve, they knew that their professional paths would always be separate.